It's been over 12 years since the disappearance of flight MH370. 3 massive searches, more than $200 million spent, and on March 8, 2026, Ocean Infinity officially called off their last search. Their CEO, Oliver Plunkett, essentially admitted what no one in the official investigation wanted to say. Maybe the plane simply isn't where we've been looking. But one man wasn't surprised. A journalist named Jeff Wise had been saying exactly that for over a decade. The aviation industry laughed at him. His own research group kicked him out. CNN stopped calling him for interviews. Netflix turned him into a punchline. But in 2026, after every search came back empty, after new scientific evidence started backing up his claims, more people are starting to wonder if Jeff Wise was right all along. But before we get into why people are starting to believe him, we need to go back to 2015 and understand why the entire aviation industry once thought he'd lost his mind. Jeff Wise had the kind of resume that made people take him seriously. Harvard-educated, licensed pilot who'd flown everything from gliders to Soviet jet fighters. When MH370 vanished in 2014, CNN brought him on as their primary aviation analyst. At the peak of the coverage, he was appearing on air up to 6 times a day, the face America saw whenever it wanted answers about the missing plane. He was also a member of the Independent Group, a small, respected team of around a dozen satellite engineers and aviation professionals running their own parallel investigation. While official agencies in Malaysia stumbled through contradictions and sat on radar data for days, the Independent Group was doing the real analytical work behind the scenes, and Wise was one of them. Then he did something that got him expelled and turned into a global punchline overnight. While everyone else was calculating where in the southern Indian Ocean the plane had hit the water, Wise started asking a completely different question. Not where the plane crashed, but whether the data pointing south could be trusted at all. Here's the background. After MH370 disappeared from radar, the only evidence it flew south came from the plane's communication system, which was still exchanging automatic signals with the Inmarsat satellite network, even after someone on board had switched off the transponder and voice radios. Scientists analyzed tiny shifts in the frequency of those signals, shifts caused by the plane's speed and direction, and concluded MH370 had traveled south into the Indian Ocean. That analysis, and nothing else, is the reason every search for the past 12 years has focused on the Southern Ocean. Jeff Wise argued those frequency readings were fake, that someone had tampered with the plane's satellite equipment to send false signals, creating a digital ghost trail pointing south while the real aircraft went in the opposite direction. In early 2015, he published a long investigative feature for New York Magazine. The headline basically asked readers, "Am I out of my mind for thinking I know where this plane actually is?" His answer was a place nobody had considered: Kazakhstan. Specifically, a disused airstrip called Yubileyny inside the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a massive space launch facility leased and operated by Russia. His theory worked like this. On a Boeing 777, there's a compartment beneath the first-class cabin floor that houses the plane's main electronics and satellite communication equipment, accessible through a trap door in the cabin. Wise pointed out that 3 passengers with Russian and Ukrainian passports were seated in the forward section of the aircraft, close to that trap door. He argued Russian operatives accessed the compartment mid-flight, tampered with the satellite unit, and fed it false data, making it look like the plane was heading south when it was actually flying north, hugging national borders to avoid radar, and ultimately landing at Baikonur. He backed it up with satellite imagery. Google Earth showed that something roughly the size of a 777 had been built on the Yubileyny runway, an airstrip abandoned for decades in the months before MH370 disappeared. Then suddenly, 4 months before MH370 vanished, construction activity appears on a disused Russian runway. A structure goes up. A month after the disappearance, the area appeared cleared and the structure demolished. Whatever was there had been erased. Wise published the before and after satellite comparisons. The timing was either an extraordinary coincidence or it wasn't. His suspected motive was a massive geopolitical distraction. MH370 disappeared on March 8, 2014, days after Russia annexed Crimea. The global news cycle pivoted overnight from Ukraine to the missing plane. And 4 months later, another Malaysia Airlines jet, flight MH17, was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a Russian military missile. All 298 people on board died. 2 Malaysian airliners destroyed within 5 months of each other. Wise framed all of it within Russia's known strategy of asymmetric warfare, deniable operations designed to create confusion and divert Western attention. He didn't see coincidence, he saw a pattern. Now, here's where we need to be completely fair, because the aviation community didn't just disagree with Wise, they tore his theory apart piece by piece. The independent group expelled him. One member called it garbage. Malaysia Airlines' former crisis director said it's physically impossible to fly a 777 from that electronics compartment. You can disable systems from down there, but you cannot control the aircraft. Mike Exner, a prominent investigator, made a critical technical point. The satellite frequency data Wise claimed was faked isn't actually generated on the plane at all. It's measured at Inmarsat ground station in Perth, Australia. If that's true, you can't tamper with it from inside the aircraft. Richard Godfrey raised what many consider the hardest question for Wise's theory. If the plane never crashed in the Indian Ocean, someone would have had to plant wreckage across 7 countries in 27 locations for 14 different people to independently discover over years. It's the fair point, and it's one Wise has spent years trying to answer, which we'll get to shortly. Russia Today ran segments accusing Wise of anti-Russia propaganda, but there was one piece of evidence that hit Wise's theory harder than anything else. 3 pieces of recovered debris were confirmed through Boeing serial numbers as belonging to the exact aircraft that operated MH370. For those parts to exist on those beaches, parts of that plane were genuinely in the Indian Ocean at some point. That's physical evidence you can't wave away. Wise didn't deny that. He never claimed the debris was fake. What he argued was even more controversial, that whoever took the plane kept pieces of the aircraft, held them for months, and then deliberately placed them into the Indian Ocean so they'd drift to shore and make the world believe the crash happened in the Southern Ocean. It was the most extreme claim anyone had made about MH370, and in 2023, Netflix decided to put it on screen. Netflix gave Wise a prominent role in their 3-part documentary, dedicating most of the 2nd episode to his theory. The series went viral, with tens of millions of viewers worldwide, and paradoxically, made his reputation even worse. Aviation professionals lined up to criticize the documentary. David Mearns called it dominated by ridiculous and unsupported theories. For most people who discovered Jeff Wise through Netflix, he was permanently filed under conspiracy theorist, and then he went quiet. Not because he gave up, because he realized arguing on TV would never prove anything, but something else might. What most people don't know is that between Netflix and his 2026 research, Wise never stopped working. He launched a podcast called Deep Dive MH370 that built a dedicated following of people who wanted real technical analysis instead of sensational headlines. He was corresponding regularly with marine biologists, drift modelers, and satellite engineers, reading every French judicial document and Australian Transport Safety Bureau report he could access. And, over several years, he shifted his entire approach, from debating what existing data meant to collecting new data that nobody else had. And the data he was after had nothing to do with satellites or radar. It had to do with something growing on the first piece of MH370 wreckage ever recovered. When the flaperon, a piece of the plane's wing, washed ashore on Réunion, a French island in the Indian Ocean, in July 2015, it was covered in small sea creatures called gooseneck barnacles. The useful thing about these barnacles is that they grow at a predictable rate, so their size can tell you roughly how long something has been floating in the ocean. They latch onto anything floating in the ocean the moment it enters the water, and they grow at a measurable rate. The bigger they are, the longer the object has been drifting. So, if the plane crashed on March 8, 2014, and the flaperon was found in July 2015, the barnacles on it should represent roughly 16 months of continuous growth. But they didn't. The largest barnacles on the flaperon were about 36 millimeters, but earlier research had already shown that was a problem. Martin Stelfox, founder of the Olive Ridley project, grew these exact same barnacles on buoys in the Maldives and found they reached 35 millimeters in just 105 days, which is 3.5 months, and they were still growing when he ended the experiment. The waters he tested in are the same current system the flaperon would have traveled through. Cynthia Venn, an environmental science professor at Bloomsburg University, estimated the barnacles on flaperons were less than 6 months old. Japanese researcher Yoichi Yusa put it at somewhere between 2 weeks and a few months. 2 weeks to 6 months on debris that supposedly spent 16 months in the water. That gap doesn't make sense unless you consider Wise's theory. If the wreckage was held on land and placed into the ocean months after the plane disappeared, the barnacles would have only started growing at the moment of placement, which means they'd be exactly as young as they are. Not a mystery, a prediction confirmed. Growth rates can vary depending on ocean conditions, and the French authorities still haven't released their largest specimens to independent researchers, but the chemistry pointed in the same direction. Barnacle shells grow in layers, and each layer locks in the temperature of the water it grew in, almost like a diary of where the object has been floating. In 2025, a research team at Kuwait University studied one of the barnacles from the flaperon. The temperature recorded in its shell showed that the flaperon had spent its last few months drifting over 1,000 miles away from where the plane supposedly crashed, close to Réunion itself, not near the search zone, near where the piece actually washed up. Then there was the waterline problem. These barnacles only grow underwater. They die if exposed to air. But when French researchers put the flaperon in a tank, it floated with roughly half its surface above the waterline. Yet barnacles covered every surface: top, bottom, leading edge, trailing edge. Healthy populations growing on surfaces that should have been in open air for over a year. Pierre Daniel, a Météo France researcher, ran hundreds of thousands of drift simulations in a confidential report. If the flaperon floated high and caught the wind, the drift math worked. It could have come from the search zone. But if it floated submerged, which the barnacle coverage demanded, the simulations showed it could not have originated from anywhere near the supposed crash site. Jim Carlton, the marine biologist who invented bioforensics by studying organisms on Japanese tsunami debris, was blunt. Barnacles don't lie. They don't grow in air. If the whole piece was colonized, it was submerged. And it wasn't just the flaperon. Over the years, roughly 3 dozen pieces of suspected MH370 wreckage turned up across the Western Indian Ocean: Réunion, Mozambique, Madagascar, Tanzania, South Africa, Mauritius. Not one showed 16 months of growth. A cabin closet door had nearly 400 barnacles, but the largest were just 20 millimeters, about 50 days of growth. A piece on Rodriguez Island, same size, same impossible timeline. A fragment at Mossel Bay in South Africa was found, photographed, let go, and rediscovered 3 months later, stripped completely clean. Compare that to what real long-term ocean drift looks like. A Japanese fishing skiff swept out by the 2011 tsunami and recovered 15 months later in Washington state was so densely encrusted with marine life, barnacles, mussels, algae, entire ecosystems, that the original hull was invisible. 15 months in the Pacific produced a floating reef. 16 months in the Indian Ocean supposedly produced sparse patches of young barnacles. And if you want an aviation comparison, look at Air France 447. That plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean in 2009. Deep water, over 4,000 meters, actually deeper than the MH370 search zone. Within 5 days, search teams had recovered bodies, seats, luggage, a leather briefcase, and located a massive visible debris field on the ocean's surface. That's what happens when a wide-body aircraft hits the ocean. You find things quickly. MH370 produced a single wing fragment 16 months later, on an island 4,000 kilometers from where it supposedly crashed. And after 12 years, that fragment and a handful of small structural pieces scattered across 2 continents is all we have. That's not the debris pattern of a normal ocean crash. If Wise is right, if different pieces were placed into the ocean at different times, this is exactly what you'd see. Each piece growing barnacles only from the moment it hit the water, some in for 50 days, some for a few months, none close to 16 months. Jeff Wise was also doing something to put real weight behind his theory. He was going out to beaches himself, physically collecting old ocean tracking devices that had washed ashore across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And his method was elegant. Those ocean tracking buoys he'd been collecting from beaches, each one has a known launch date and a precise record of how long it's spent in the water, sometimes months, sometimes years. When they wash ashore, the barnacles growing on them become natural controls. Real-world specimens growing on objects with verified, documented histories. You know exactly how long those barnacles had to grow, in what waters, at what temperatures. Compare those growth patterns to what's on the MH370 debris, and you finally have an answer based on evidence. He collected more than a dozen buoys, compared the growth patterns to each buoy's known timeline. He built this data set from scratch because nobody else had bothered to. Not the Australian investigators who spent years running computer drift models. Not the French who had the actual barnacle specimens locked in custody. Not the Malaysian government. The one piece of original fieldwork that could actually settle the debate, and a journalist did it alone. The result confirmed what every marine biologist had quietly said for a decade. The real-world growth from his trackers didn't match the MH370 debris timeline. The barnacles are too young, by the better part of a year, exactly the gap his planted debris theory predicts. The plane was carrying 221 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries from Motorola in the forward cargo hold, right next to the electronics compartment. Similar lithium fires caused sudden silence and total loss of control in UPS Flight 6 and Asiana Flight 991. One piece of debris found in Madagascar showed clear burn marks, flagged as possible MH370, but never investigated. An oil rig worker named Mike McKay reported seeing a plane on fire that night over the South China Sea. His report was filed, dismissed, never followed up. And that's not the only thing that's been quietly buried. Even after 12 years, 4 governments, Malaysia, Australia, China, and the United States, have never released any new raw data. Malaysia's Prime Minister at the time, Najib Razak, was later found guilty by Malaysian courts in the 1MDB scandal, billions of dollars missing from the country's own development fund while he was in power. The same government that gave false information about radar contact in the first 48 hours has never stopped controlling the narrative. Compare this to Amelia Earhart. For nearly 90 years, the world accepted a simple explanation. Engine trouble over the Pacific, a crash somewhere near Howland Island, and 2 people swallowed by the ocean. Governments classified key evidence, Navy records, intelligence reports, witness testimonies, and kept them sealed for decades. Searches focused on the open ocean around her planned route. When those documents were finally declassified in 2025, the picture that emerged was completely different. The evidence pointed toward Earhart and her navigator being captured by the Japanese military after landing in the Marshall Islands, not crashing into the sea at all. 80 years of looking in the wrong place because the people who had the answers refused to share them. It's hard not to see the parallels. The families of the 239 people on board are still waiting. Voice 370, the group that represents them, has begged Malaysia not to abandon the search. There are no confirmed plans to go back. None of this proves Jeff Wise was right about Kazakhstan. The technical objections haven't gone away. Nobody has demonstrated a method to fake the satellite data from inside the aircraft. 3 confirmed Boeing serial numbers mean parts of this plane were in the ocean, and planting wreckage across 7 countries for random civilians to find over years is extraordinarily hard to accept. Those are serious problems with his specific theory, but his theory made 2 specific, testable predictions. First, the debris would show signs of being placed in the water months after the disappearance. Second, the plane wouldn't be found on the southern Indian Ocean seabed. The idea that Russia hijacked a passenger jet and landed it in Central Asia still sounds almost impossible to believe. But the barnacle evidence, the actual science, has no answer. Nobody has explained why every single piece of MH370 debris carries months less growth than it should. Nobody has explained why 140,000 square kilometers of seabed came back empty. To the families of the 239 people on board, if any part of this was hard to hear, I'm sorry. You deserve answers. No more theories or debates.